Okay, so we are going to work with a little bit of temperature and oxygen profile data. And I have a particular way that I like to make these graphs. And it's a little tricky to do this in Excel. So I'm going to show you how I make these graphs. Now, if you can figure out a better way, please let me know. But I know that this works. So we know that temperature and oxygen can change as we go from the surface to the bottom of a lake. And we want a way to graphically present temperature and oxygen data in such a way that it makes it easy to understand what's going on in the lake, and it makes it easy to interpret. And since we usually record temperature and oxygen from the surface all the way down to the bottom at regular intervals, we want to plot that data, and we want both the temperature and the oxygen on the same graph, because they often change in a similar manner, but sometimes they don't. But you really need to look at both of these things simultaneously in order to understand your lake. So here's an example of what we want to build here. All right, and this is from some old data that I took a few years ago. And so in this graph, open circles represent oxygen, and the dark triangles represent temperature. And if you look at the graph closely, you can see that at least on this date at this time, the water was well mixed. The oxygen did not change much from surface to the bottom, and the temperature did not change much from the surface to the bottom. Now these graphs are a little different than your typical graphs. Typically, you want the independent variable to be on the x-axis and the dependent variable to be on the y-axis. But with these kind of graphs, we put depth on the y-axis, and that's the independent variable. We're saying that oxygen and temperature depend upon depth. It's not that the depth depends upon temperature and oxygen. And so we're putting the independent variable on the y-axis and the dependent variables on the x-axis. Also, you'll note that the y-axis is reversed. Well, this makes the graph then represent a cross-section of the lake, where you have the surface at the top of the graph and the bottom of the lake at the bottom of the graph. We also like to put temperature and oxygen on separate axes because they're usually on kind of different scales, and we want them to graph properly. So, for example, if you have a really warm lake and it's really low in oxygen, if you put them on the same scale, then the oxygen would look funny. So we just want these things, but a better reason is these are separate items, and they each deserve their own axis. And now another thing I like to do is to put the site and the date and the time right on the graph, because these things are very important to interpreting what's going on in the graph. I should probably put a legend on there too, so that you know which one of these is oxygen and which one is temperature. So we'll probably do that. If we don't put this stuff right on the graph, we definitely need to put that information in the figure caption so you can tell one graph from another. So as I said, what makes these graphs tricky is that the independent variables on the y-axis and the dependent variables are on two separate x-axes. Now, I looked it up, and Excel can do two x-axes, but it still treats them as if they're the independent variables, and in fact the dependent variables, and it just seemed to be a mess when I tried to use it. So I have not yet figured out how to make a proper temperature DO graph using Excel's two x-axes. Again, if you can figure that out, let me know, because it might be a little simpler. But I don't know if it'll be simpler, because my solution is pretty simple and it works. My solution is to build the graph in Excel with temperature and oxygen on separate y-axes and depth on the x-axis. that is how you would normally expect to graph things. But then when we put the figure in Word or PowerPoint, we just rotate it 90 degrees. And then it makes the type of profile that I'm talking about. So if you look on the left, this is what the graph actually looked like when I built it in Excel. And so all the text, all the numbers, everything is rotated 90 degrees. And if you look at it this way, you see depth, which is the independent variable, is on the x-axis, and temperature and oxygen, which are the dependent variables, are on the two separate y-axes. But then on the right, you see what happens when we just paste it and rotate it. Now we've made that profile graph like we want, and it looks great. Okay, so step one is to find your extremes. So normally we're graphing several sites and or dates and or times, and we want to directly compare all these graphs. So a real good practice is to make the same scale on all the axes. That way you can directly compare the shape of the curve across all your different sampling sites and dates and times. So my first thing is to find the range of temperature, oxygen, and depth across all the graphs, and that will tell me the minimum and maximum values to use on all axes. So in the example I'm going to show you here, the maximum depth is 7 meters. The temperatures run from 10 to 28 Celsius. The oxygen values run from 0.3 to 8.7 parts per million. So I'm going to scale my depth axis to go from 0 to 7. Temperature is going to run from 8 to 30, so that gives a little padding. And oxygen is going to run from 0 to 10 parts per million. And I normally start oxygen at 0 because that's an important point when you're talking about oxygen. I want to see on my curve how close I'm getting to anoxia. Step 2 then is to take that information and start building your graph in Excel. And that's what the next part of this video is going to be. And I'll show you how to do that in just a moment. Once it's built in Excel, step 3 is to paste it into Word or maybe PowerPoint. And once it's in Word, you just rotate it to its proper orientation. And you always remember to add a proper figure caption. All right. So let's go to work in Excel. So here we are looking at some of the raw data. This is how I like to set things up, and we don't have to look at all of these. You realize that this is a single site, and it was taken at 9:50 in the morning. Here you see that we've got depth, and at each depth I have the temperature and the oxygen, and for some reason I have a second depth there, which I don't need. And you'll notice I have some other information in here like the latitude, longitude, which we could use later. And so this is the data that I want, or these are the data that I want to graph. And so what I'm going to do is first notice that I've got depth first, then temperature, then oxygen. And that's a good idea because depth, again, is the independent variable. So it's nice to have that first. So I'm going to select all those. And I'm going to go to Insert. I'm going to insert a chart. And it's going to be a scatter plot with a smooth line. This is how I like to do it. And so here we've got the chart, and it's got a lot of data on it. First thing we're going to do to make our lives easier is we're going to make this chart bigger, and we're going to make it its own page. So I'm going to come up here and click on Move Chart. I'm going to say it's New Sheet, and we'll leave it named Chart 3. That's fine. Now another advantage of doing this is that if you do this on every chart, they will all be exactly the same size. So when you paste them into Word, they will all be exactly the same size. Whereas if you don't do this, you may drag and change the sizes, and they're all different sizes, and it doesn't look as good. So if we glance at this, you can see that it worked. If you look at the x-axis and you see that it's depth, and you see that the orange line is oxygen, and you can see kind of the smooth change, that there's not much change in oxygen with depth. And same thing with temperature, there's not much change. But you see how they're on the same x-axis, and you see what I was talking about earlier, how the oxygen often gets kind of crowded here at the bottom, and you don't see the true shape of it. So we're going to do a lot of things. They don't all have to be done in this particular order, but they all have to be done at some point. So let's get started. First thing we're going to do is get rid of chart title, which I don't want. We're going to get rid of these stupid grid lines, which I hate. We are going to put the oxygen on its own axis. So let's click on the oxygen line, and now we're going to right click, and we're going to format data series. And you see that that brings up this over here. Now, I don't know what version of Excel I have. I think I have the 2016 version. Most of the newer ones are like this. Older versions of Excel don't look like this. You're going to have to look around, but you still have the same options. They're just hidden. Now you see what happened to come up this first time is my option to plot series on primary or secondary axis. Now you want to watch where some of these things show up over here in this format data series box. You see that I'm on this last thing, which is series options. Here I've got effects. Here I've got fill in line. I want to come over here and I want to choose secondary axis. Now you see how those lines changed shape very much. And you see why we want these on different axes. Alright, so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to scale all these axes based upon those values that I found earlier. So let's start with the temperature axis. And when I click on it, you see that over here it now switches to format axis. And then you have more options. But we want to come over here to the axis options. And we want to set the minimum we said was going to be 10. Something wrong with my num lock there. Let's try that again. There we go. My maximum was going to be 30. And you may want to play with the major and minor units, but those look good to me. And I want to go ahead and put some tick marks on there at the major tick. I want to make a cross. And if you look over here, that just made a little cross there. And you see here, it's doing it every 2 degrees centigrade, which, you know, again, you can play with that. Now, while I'm here, let's go ahead and rotate these numbers, because these numbers have to be rotated 90 degrees to the left, so that when I then rotate 90 degrees to the right, they'll look good. Well, that's going to be up here under text options. And you see I've got several things here, and I want to go to the last one, which is the text box. And here is my text direction. And you see that I'm going to rotate all text 270 degrees, which is the same as rotating it 90 degrees left. And there you go. Now I could also change the font size, but I'm happy with what I see right now. Now the only other thing I think I want to do while I am working on this first x-axis is all axes need a label, right? So I'm going to come up here to Chart Elements, click on it, and I need Axes Titles. And I'm going to go ahead and check that box, and you see I've got a title on all three axes now. So I'm going to come over here and click on that box, and I'm going to label this one Temperature in Celsius. And so that's the temperature axis. Let's repeat for the oxygen axis. Click on that one. My first thing is to go back to Axis Options. I wanted to set the minimum at 0, which it already is, and the maximum at 10. And I want to set my tick marks as a cross. And now I want to go to Text Options, choose this text box, and again I want to rotate 270. At this point I'm going to save because I don't want to lose my work. And we'll click on my axis title, which is going to be oxygen in parts per million. Finally, let's work on the depth axis. Again, let's set the range from 0 to 7 meters. Make the tick marks across. Rotate the text 270 degrees. Change the axis title to depth in meters. Now you'll notice that whereas the other two axis titles were already rotated and will be fine, when I rotate this one, it's not going to be fine. I want this text box rotated. So while it's selected, again, I'm going to come over here. You see this is now Format the Axis Title, and I have the same options as before. So let's rotate that 270. And look at that. All right, now let's go ahead and change these series because I might not be printing this, putting this somewhere where it'll be in color. You know, you always have to think about if you publish things or if they're going to be printed, you have to think about how they're going to look in black and white. And right now, you can tell the difference between these two because one's orange and one's blue. But if I printed this, they would look exactly the same. So I want them to look different. And I like to make oxygen open circles because oxygen starts with an O. So I'm going to click on this. And I have Format Data Series over here now. And I want to look at the fill and line. And so the line, I'm going to make this line, how's a gradient line look? Nope. We'll do an automatic, but let's change it to a dash type maybe. There you go. And I want the color to be black, so it'll print. And that didn't work. Oh, there we go. And that's for the line. And I also need to work on the marker. And I want the marker fill to be no fill. I want it to open circle. I want the border to be a solid line, and it's in black. And let's click off of this and see how it looks. And so you see that I've got open circles that are black, but they don't show up very well. So let's make that bigger. And how do we make that bigger? Oh, I'm on the wrong thing. I'm on plot options. Now I'm on my data series. That's why I couldn't figure it out. Okay, let's go back to marker. And let's try changing the width. Maybe 2 points. That makes them show up a little bit better. Not 100% sure how I can make those circles go larger. I mean, let's just do something ridiculous and make this like 8. Oh, there you go. That did it. Now they're filled, though. Let's change that back to no fill. Come on now. So it is on no fill. So this is where, aha, here's what we need to change. All right, well, excuse me for casting about a little bit, but now I've got it. So first off, I want to go back to that border and make this border a more realistic, like 1 point. But if I want the circles to get bigger, I need to come up here to marker options. The built-in type is an open circle, and here's where I want to make the size bigger. And there's your open circles for oxygen. Okay. So now let's format the temperature. So I select it. I want a solid line that's black, and that's good. Let's go to the marker. The marker type I want to change to a triangle, and let's make it a little bigger. And the fill on that triangle needs to be black, and the border doesn't really matter. Oh, no, it does matter because I can see a blue border, and I don't like a blue border. So the border is going to be a solid line that is also black. Ah! See, you click on the plot area, and then you think you're changing something, and you're not changing it. Very frustrating. Let's go back to marker. Let's go to border, and we're going to change the color to black. Okay, save our work. All right, so there we have everything labeled and rotated. Now let's take this legend and let's go ahead and see if we can't rotate it by going to text options, text box, rotate 270, and it scrunched it up, but if we drag it out, well, that looks terrible. So it rotated the text but not the legend. And if we go to the options, we can't. This is probably why I did not have a legend on the first one. So what we'll have to do is get rid of this. And we'll just have to put something in the figure caption about which is temperature and which is oxygen. Might have to figure out something else to do here. Okay, the last thing that we could do is label this with the location and the time. And so the way we can do that is we're going to go up here to Insert, and we're going to insert a text box. And we're going to drag the text box here. And we're going to type our information. So this is Spring Lake. And the date is September 6, 2007. And the time was 9:50. And the location was the dam. And now we clicked off of that. Let's click back onto it. Let's come over here to Format Shape, Text Options, Text Box, Text Directions, Rotate All 270, and it's rotated. And one other thing I would like to do is I would like to make a standard size for this text box so that they're always the same. And so if I select it, come over here to Format Shape, look at Shape Options, and look at Size and Properties, I have something where I can set the height and the width. So if I made that a standard 1.5 inches high and 2 inches wide, and now every time I make one, I know the text boxes will be exactly the same size. And so I can put that maybe right there. And there you have it. Of course, we save. And now we're going to launch Word. And hit a few returns, give ourselves some space. And I'm going to go to Excel, and I'm going to select that whole graph, and Control C to copy. Now come over here. Another thing I want to do is I do not want to just paste the graph, because it'll paste an active version of the graph, and I don't want that because that'll mess up the formatting. I just want to paste a picture, which is right here. And so it's not active, I can't edit it, but I don't want to edit it, it's fine. Now it's a picture, and again I can set the size so it's consistent, and if I always make the Excel graphs the same size, then when I paste them they're the same size, and then I can always come in here and do something like 50%, and so then they'll all be shrunk to the same size and it'll be beautiful. And I can grab this little thing and turn it. Ta-da! And there is my temperature profile graph. And of course I need to say figure 1, temperature, solid triangles, and oxygen, open circles. Profile data from the Spring Lake Dam on September 6, 2000, what? 7. And I need to save this, but I'll save it after I'm done here because I want you to look at it. And now you can see that we've just made a temperature and oxygen profile graph. You can see that it was basically isothermal, and there was a little bit of oxygen stratification, but the oxygen was in general quite low from top to bottom. Now I'm looking at this, and I may want to increase the font size on the axes and on the labels because they don't look big enough to read. I mean, of course I could zoom in, but really they'd be more substantial. So that may be something I would change, but that's the procedure. Let me know if you got any questions.